Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to this one-day event on race and gender in law and political economy. My name is Ivana Isailović. I'm assistant professor of law here at UBA, and I'm also the academic coordinator of the Global Economic Law Project, which is within which this event is organized. So this is a somewhat a different type of conference, and I'm really grateful that to all of you who are here today, and especially to our speakers who traveled to Amsterdam to help us create this unique intellectual space. The main goal of this workshop is to explore the interconnections between race, gender, in relation to law and economic structures. And the reason why this conference is a little bit different is because in continental Europe, these notions, gender and race, are sometimes erased, but very often they are treated as marginal or as a footnote. I'm sure that many of us have been in these huge conferences where we just lump these topics together in one or maybe two panels if we're lucky. Or these questions get confused with issues of representation, and then it creates even more confusion. And these dynamics also happen in critical circles where there is an effort to think differently about law and political economy. But for several decades now, materialist feminists, critical race theorists, and other critical scholars have shown us time and again how our economic structures are deeply racialized and gendered. In other words, we can't think about the organization of the economy and of our societies without understanding just how central race and gender inequalities are. And these important insights have actually never been systematically and fully integrated into European legal thinking about the economy and the law. And they are often, as I said, very much relegated to the margins of legal thinking. And this lack of serious engagement with these notions then contributes to creating a narrow understanding of the economy and of the role of law in creating, sustaining, and legitimizing various forms of inequalities, injustices, and different forms of violence that impact our everyday lives. And then this very incomplete and partial understanding of the law becomes the law that is then passed on to new generations of lawyers, which makes it even more difficult to engage with race and gender in classrooms. So in contrast to these dominant tendencies in law, this event situates itself in the intellectual space opened up by many feminists and critical race and critical scholars decades ago. And this is also not a traditional conference because it is designed primarily as a space for cross-disciplinary co-learning. And this also explains its format. So the first panel will be about methods. The starting point is that the law constitutes the economy. In other words, that the economy is not separated from the law and social relations, and that has been central to the writings of many scholars in this room who have been working on these issues for decades. Some of these issues have been recently picked up by the law and political economy movement that is based in the US and that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, and which to a large extent respond to very specific US concerns in US academia. So this is the starting premise of the conversation this morning. Now, within that context, I asked all of our speakers to reflect on some of the following questions. How do you do research on law and political economy in relation to gender and race? What are the methodological moves and assumptions? And what is the understanding of the law that you mobilize? What in law, so legal techniques, discourses, modes of legal thinking, explain the lack of legal engagements with gender and race, or forms of resistance to this kind of engagement? And what are the unknowns that need our attention, or practices, ideas that we need to nurture and develop? So this conversation is designed to sort of set up the stage and open up questions that we will explore throughout this day. And it will be followed up by more sort of thematic focus panels on property, value, and labor that structure our economy. And in each of them, I asked the speakers to address the connection between these concepts and then race and gender. And in the final panel, speakers will reflect on some of the important themes and put on the table more questions, more provocations. So we won't be able to, most likely, we won't be able to tackle all of these questions today. But the hope is that this kind of event can pave the way for more sustained forms of engagement and conversations around these underexplored issues. So I want to thank again the speakers for coming to Amsterdam, for accepting to generously share their ideas and their work. I want to also thank my colleagues from UvA who accepted to chair the panels and be part of this conversation. And finally, as you know, this type of event is not easy to organize, and there's a lot of work that remains often invisible. So I do want to really thank Alicia on the roof, Prachi, Akaro, who is not here, but who you met outside, and Gushe Westov, who you also met outside, and who helped me a lot with the organization of this event and make this event happen. And finally, I also want to acknowledge that an event such as this one would not have happened without the support that I received from many colleagues in this law faculty, and without the support of UvA, who's hosting this conversation today. Okay, so now let me introduce the first, well, I'm going to introduce the moderator for the first panel on methods, because like I'm going to introduce the first one. No. Kang, associate professor at Warwick University. Her multidisciplinary work focuses on intellectual property, knowledge techniques, transmissions and practices, construction of values and valuation practices, concepts of novelty and innovation, and legal and social theory. Thank you, Ko, for moderating this panel, for being part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for Ivana and Alicia for hosting this, organizing this, and I also want to acknowledge the enormous conceptual work and preparation that has actually gone into this one-day event. There was a lot of activity going on for quite a long time, trying to understand what the key issues are that we wanted to discuss, and I think it's really exciting to see this wide range of work that we will discuss today. And that's why I also want to take some time to introduce the speakers and the work and the backgrounds, because you will see the breadth of collective knowledge that is present in the room. So before I introduce the speakers, I actually also want to say a few words about Dr. Isailović. I think you all know her. She's assistant professor of EU law here at the University of Amsterdam, and she's published widely on issues at the intersection of law, gender studies, critical theory, and political economy. The recent publication, the Yale Journal of International Law, examines gender equality as investment, EU work-life balance measures, and the neoliberal shift. And as you all know, I think she's a tour de force, which is to state the obvious, but I think the obvious still needs to be mentioned and acknowledged. So thank you so much, Ivana, for organizing and convening us. I want to go through, actually, they're all sitting in the right order. So I want to introduce Professor Diamond Ashiagbor from University of Kent, who has conducted research in the fields of labor and employment law. Also EU law and regional integration, law and development. So her research interests, I think, intersect with one another, but also she has really amazing expertise in all of these areas in depth. In her work, she has long adopted a socio-legal approach to the study of law, society, and economy. In the areas of labor law and social policy, she has examined the relationship between markets and real and social, with a focus on regional integration in sub-Saharan Africa and Europe. Her recent article, Race and Colonialism in the Construction of Labor Markets and Precarity, has explored interconnections and continuities between racial inequalities in labor market in conjunction with legacies of colonialism and racial distinctions. Right next to Diamond, we find Dr. Vanja Hamzić, who is a reader in law, history, and anthropology at University of London, SOAS. Vanja has conducted legal, anthropological, and historical research that address issues in human subjectivity formation, especially those related to gender, sexual, class, race, and linguistic and religious differences. She also conducted fieldwork in Pakistan, Indonesia, Senegal, and Louisiana. He has also studied how gender non-conforming individuals and communities in Pakistan, Indonesia, and in West Africa have braved forms of legally sanctioned oppression, such as racial capitalism, colonialism, and how in turn they have developed and practiced insurrectionary vernacular knowledge. Then we have Dr. Robert Knox, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool, and his research interests encompass the relationship between law and the political economic structures of capitalism. He has specific expertise in public international law, particularly on relation between race and empire, public law with a focus of its relationship to neoliberalism, and the process of juridification. And his recent work, actually you are so prolific, it was very hard to pick and focus on your work, but I found actually very interesting. He also examined the relationship between law and political economy, and the process of juridification, and showed how juridification cements and isolate the idea of the economy from popular control, and thus facilitates and embeds neoliberalism. So this is an amazing range of different subfields of law that I think we find in this room, and I'm really pleased that they want to share with us how they actually go about their work, however you want to define methodology. So if it's okay, Jonathan, I'm going to start out.
I'd like to start by thanking Alicia and Branchi for all their organisational work in bringing us all together. But most of all, to thank Dr. Ivana Isailović, as Hio said, the conceptualization and then the follow through of to a project like this, a sort of series of curated conversations really, has been so productive because it's deliberately not structured as a conventional conference. And one of the things that we did was we were asked to share 2-page summaries of how we related to the themes of gender, race, law and political economy, and some of our published work or working draft. And that was already very, very interesting to read people's work, and also work by others that they found interesting and productive. and one of the pieces I read, which by Rob actually, on international law, race and capitalism, a Marxist perspective, that was published just this year in the American Journal of International Law. And I'm just now thinking, oh, I don't think I need to say anymore. Just everyone should just go and read Rob's piece. Although, you know, I'm not adopting Marxist perspective, but he explains with such clarity these complicated questions of how we bring into conversation. So for me, I'm going to use like different language from Rob, the phenomena of sort of legal phenomena, economic phenomena, and social phenomena, how we bring those into conversation, but also for me, how we conceptualize the study of law, economics, and society. So what I'm interested in is how the disciplines of law, in my case, sociology and economics, how we can bring those three into conversation in order to explain legal phenomena, economic phenomena, and social phenomena. And especially in the context of this particular conversation around gender and race, I'm going to prioritize race a little, but you'll see that I also talk about gender. And the question I begin with is, and for this session on methods, and I'll be speaking later more specifically about labour, one of my main areas of substantive research interest. So my question to begin with is, how can we best theorise and locate race in the relationship between law, economy, and society? And one question I have is, to what extent is race constituted in and through the laws underpinning economic relations? The language of racial capitalism has gained prevalence as a productive way to rethink law and political economy. And there's just been a cottage industry of conferences, seminar publications using the language of racial capitalism, but its legal specificity and juridical form is often missing from these analyses. So for instance, there are disputes, contestation about the direction of causality. So for instance, a reference point that many of us have had is Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, which was initially published in 1944. And so some, such as Williams, consider slavery's origins to be economic, not racial. Whereas to some extent, Cedric Robinson has a slightly different take, contending that race permeates social structures emergent from capitalism. And one way of describing Cedric Robinson's work is that all capitalism is racial capitalism, and racism and capitalism are, in this sense, co-constitutive. Another way that Robinson has to describe this phenomenon is that it's described race as a regime. I also find very useful Chantal Thomas's language of race as a technology of global economic governance. So for my particular interest is, how and where does race feature in the legal form by which markets are governed, and more specifically, the legal form by which labour is regulated? So just to put on the table even more kind of configurations, Cedric Robinson, writing in Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, uses the term racial regimes, defining them as constructed social systems in which race is proposed as a justification for relations of power. And I find that really, really helpful. Constructed social systems in which race is a justification for relations of power. And just to go back to Eric Williams about which came first, this is a quotation from Capitalism and Slavery. Here then is the origin of Negro slavery. The reason was economic, not racial. It had to do not with the colour of the labourer, but with the cheapness of the labour. Okay. So in terms of methods, as I said, the language of law and political economy and the language of racial capitalism are, so LPE as a brand almost feels quite new, but actually the phenomenon it's talking about is very old. We can go back to Max Weber, we can go back to Marx, we can go back to Karl Polanyi. So I draw on Polanyi, 1944, the Great Transformation, and also his work on the economy as instituted process. And so Polanyi refers to the economy as instituted process, meaning that market economy is institutionalized through the power of the state, through law. And building on Polanyi, I make use of the language of economic sociology and economic sociology of law. So economic sociology is both an approach, a theoretical approach, and potentially a method, because it's a way of undertaking when using, sorry, let me just, it's a way of applying sociological approaches, analytical, normative, empirical, to investigate relations between law and economy, as I said, both as a theoretical framework and as a methodological approach. And so I find that quite useful when I think about applying that to law, because it's a way of thinking about helping us to better appreciate law's constitutive role in markets and other forms of economic activity, how legal concepts construct the market, reflect and shape economic activity. As a labour lawyer, I then want to think about how that can be sort of operationalised in specific contexts of what we refer to as labour markets, which is perhaps conceding something, commodifying people's labour power. The use of the language of economic sociology of law is one shortcut to understanding that markets are not this separate realm, but are very much embedded in social relations. They are social constructs. And as I said, for me, it's helpful to think about the relationship between the phenomena of markets, economy, society and law, and also the relationship between the scholarly disciplines. Sabine Freyrichs puts it quite well. She talks about economic sociology as an integrative effort in connecting law, economy, and society, both as spheres of reality and as fields of scholarly interest. And I found that a really useful frame starting with Polanyi, but the political economy that is undertaken in that frame, and including in the LPE world, the political economy capitalism that is invoked in much of that scholarship is usually absent any colonial underpinnings. And what is missing for me from, for instance, economic sociology of law, many law and political economy approaches, or labour law scholarship, which is what I'm more familiar with, what's missing is an analysis of the role of colonialism, race and racial capitalism. And so the intervention I'd like to make is that, to these conversations around law and political economy, is that not only does race permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism, but that it's actually embedded in the legal form by which, in my particular area, labour is regulated, and in particular, the labour contract. So I just, in a minute and a bit, want to give you a little bit of a summary of how I use this emergent tradition of economic sociology of law. So Sabine Freyrichs and Amanda Perikasaris describe social life, including in its economic and legal aspects, as usually conceptualized as operating through four mutually constitutive levels. So actors or actions, interactions, regimes, and nationalities. So at the very sort of lowest level, micro-analytical level, the focus is on actors and theories of action, so relations between actors. At the meso-analytical level, the focus turns from actors to interactions involving two or more actors. So actors or interactions, to come back to race and labour, is a useful way to understand how most race discrimination in employment is conceptualised within law. For instance, as prejudice or harassment between individuals within institutions is at the level of interpersonal relations that the law understands race, the law understands race discrimination. So in legislative enactments in most of our jurisdictions, the focus is on difference, differential treatment, disparate treatment, less favourable treatment. The language is, in some jurisdictions, of protected characteristics. You're treating somebody less favourably because of their race. And so race is at least officially conceived as a matter of individual level demographic characteristics. And by this account, racism exists at this micro level of social action as the product of acts or beliefs of individuals or groups of individuals. Sometimes, though, legislative acknowledgement legislation acknowledges the role of institutions in racialized ordering. For instance, in many of our jurisdictions, we have not just prohibition on direct discrimination, treating somebody less favorably, we have prohibitions on indirect discrimination or disparate impact, which would be that you have facially neutral organizational rules. You have to be fluent in Dutch in order to take this job, although the job is not customer facing. So that's facially neutral rule that has a disparate impact on non-native speakers. Okay, so the legislation does acknowledge what I'm talking about, the next level of interaction that suggests legal provisions can be underpinned by more complex understanding of inequality and a conception of race operating at the meso level of social action. This moves beyond individual animus or prejudice to encompass interactions between individual institutions. But sometimes we also have an awareness at the level that state law and policy of systemic or structural racism in, for example, labour markets, not solely discrimination at the level of an organisation. And that comes closer to recognition that sociologists of race have identified that racism structures societal institutions, and that race is inscribed and re-inscribed in markets and other economic structures. So this way of conceptualizing racism can be seen as mapping onto the macro level analysis of social scale envisaged in economic sociology of law. So here we can see racism has been understood as a social regime. But a fourth or meta level of analysis of society, economy, and law turns to the rationalities behind a given regime or social order in terms of modes of reasoning or ways of apprehending the world. And this is a level that I find most useful. So according to Sabine Frerichs, whilst regimes refer to the institutional structure or culture that makes up society, rationalities comprise the basic principles located deep beyond the surface structure of society. So to go back to Kang and my interest in exploring the racial underpinnings of the labour market, my focus is on regimes and rationalities, the macro and the meta level that constitute market society at large. So in other words, I'm interested in exploring race in contemporary labour markets, and to do that, I conceptualize race and racism as a rationality, namely an epistemic category that organizes our perceptions and evaluations of reality. And a productive way to characterize this rationality is through the language of racial capitalism. To come at the beginning, that race permeates the social structures emergent from capitalism. Thus, racial capitalism is a dominant rationality or way of seeing the world, which I argue underpins the market economy and racialized inequality in the contemporary labour market. So I'm going to end there. And as I said, a lot of the other interventions sort of start there and take that observation more deeply. But end there and hand over to Vanja.
Thank you so much, Simon. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Ivana, Prachi, Alicia, everyone who contributed to this wonderful event. And I'm delighted to be on this wonderful table and look forward to a conversation. And here, thank you for a very generous introduction and your stewardship of this panel. I'm a legal historian, legal anthropologist, interested in queer and feminist perspectives on gender, law, history, sexuality, and so on. And so that's my kind of lens. And that, by definition, almost means all sorts of methods being constantly interrogated from a variety of perspectives. But my work, broadly conceived, is about historical and present-day gender diverse and gender non-conforming communities in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and in West Africa, and especially those related to various historical Muslim polities, particularly Muslim gunpowder empires. And then the many ways these communities sought to resist and subvert the onslaught of Euro-American capitalism and systemic enslavement. So, as it turns out, one of the chief, but less explored perhaps, facets of the European imperialistic economic, social, political, and indeed legal project was the gradual imposition of the racialized colonial gender binary. And for the past 8 or so years, I've been working across the archives of the Atlantic world, so as to try to really tell critically, to the extent possible, from a variety of sources and perspectives, how the racialized colonial gender binary was worked out and inflicted on enslaved gender diverse West Africans in the 18th century. First, in the French and British entrepôts or outposts in Senegambia, and then on enslavers' ships sailing through the Middle Passage, and finally in what was first French so-called and then Spanish so-called colonial Louisiana, where enslaved West Africans joined indigenous enslaved and indentured lower class Europeans in various modes of resistance against the plantation system in the making, a chief source of Euro-American racial capitalism. So right from the start, European colonial law has been an essential ingredient of the political, social, and economic system of racial capitalism. It rendered stark hierarchies of human worth the source of the colonial difference in categorization, both legitimate and just, and it joined other governance and would-be scientific colonial efforts to socially entrench those invented hierarchies that even proclaimed them natural. For example, in the 18th century, which, as I said, is the primary temporal locale of my current research, the economic cum naturalist logic of both international and municipal law preceded and enabled the 19th century proliferation of scientific racism, as well as a systemic commodification of would-be bodily or relational or psychological human differences, which among many other long-lasting consequences ossified the gender binary. So colonial law and its enduring post-colonial variants and hybrids made sure that access to justice and redress be systematically disaggregated along the racial, gender, and class fault lines. So racial capitalism then and the colonial gender binary are both the enduring and mutually inseparable legacies of European imperialism, and I have found numerous methodological orientations and theoretical sensitivities helpful in studying their intricate interconnections. So for instance, the colonial South American thought emphasized the continuity of coloniality as condition, or rather as the sine qua non of racial capitalism. One can also learn from Jackie Alexander, the critical queer feminist researcher from the Caribbean, in her exposition of strategies of recolonization and the commodification of alienated expressions of sexual and gender alterity. The post-colonial racial capitalist legal systems help not only maintain the colonial difference with its superimposed categories of personhood and implicit worth, but also recolonize, recommodify sexual and gender alterity. And I have studied this in the context of both international and municipal law, and I'm sure here I don't have to, project much to say this, and you will agree that law is rarely, if ever, a liberatory mechanism, precisely because it is so ideologically and ideologically embedded in the racial capitalist cis patriarchy. So I share with you a short piece by Isailović, who is just like quite a few of us here, I suppose, a heterodox scholar of the historical formations of racial capitalism. And what I particularly value in Law's work and method is that it does not fall into the trap of dwelling on the differences between various European and then also American racial capitalist imperial projects as at the expense of many intimacies, as she calls them, and learning practices between them. So mutual imperial rivalries and capitalist competition cannot explain away the interconnections and therefore multiple levels of complicity, personal, national, international, relational, academic in terms of the institutionalized knowledge production, economic, and so on, arising between them. And I feel that our critical and methodological sensitivities should be able to account both for these crucial imperial intimacies and new universalisms, including those arising and abiding through law, and their particularisms and differences which prompt us to focus on the locale and on the microhistorical. So equally, resistance can be studied both as a form of situated knowledge and action, as well as a way to combine previously distant and disparate forms of insurrectionary subjectivity, including that relative to cosmological and social gender diversity of the oppressed. The law piece I sent also suggests the need, as I'm sure you could have read, for this, what she calls history hesitant method. Let me quote it again, right? This crucial couple of sentences. For hesitation, as she says, rather than rushing to recover what has been lost, for hesitation that may provide a space, a different temporality, so that we may reckon with the connections that could have been but were lost and are thus not yet. So this critical hesitance really resonates deeply with my own research. My work is based on oral and formative and traditional histories of Senegambian and Louisianan life world just as much as on written sources. And it's what they call critically ethnographic, but if you will, it's critical ethnographic that it simply insists on challenging the implicit hierarchy of historical sources in the 18th century West African colonial Louisiana, which is, to a large degree, yet another violent legacy of early colonial sciences of the human, its genders, and its senses of the past. I share my piece on after Oman Adams as an example of these violent European perspectives and legacies. There's one particular aspect that I find lacking still somewhat in critical scholarship on race, gender, and law, and that is a concerted investment in the question of racial capitalist production time. So Safet Haji Mohamedovich and I have used the term distemporalization to describe colonial and other projects of denial of time, a denial of historicity, futurity or change, which is a significant element of various constructions of otherness. And we have also taken this temporality to signify a refusal of an intervention into qualitatively specific temporal life worlds, such as those in the context of my own work of 18th century Senegambians forcibly brought to colonial Louisiana, or those of indigenous inhabitants of that colony's unceded lands. So here's an example. Temporality was in fact Senegambian gender non-conforming griots or Jeliu chief domain. Since past events were often believed to be in causal relationship with present and future happenings. Owing to Griot's wordsmithery, oral histories were socially constructed and understood as both the history of today and the history of tomorrow, with the body of the oral historian mediating any potential temporal and mystical borders between them. This would in turn make a Griot's body both volatile and inviolable. And whilst racial capitalism ruptured dramatically such bodily, communal, and temporal assemblages, perhaps one can at least allow for the hesitant and partial archival traces of a non-conforming past to interrupt the ways we see certain fixed formations of selfhood in time. So I argue in my current work that the linearity of the past, present, future trajectory, that it remains an obstacle to such interruptive interpretive possibilities. So to sum it up as a series of open-ended questions that hopefully we can have a great discussion later, what can work on racial capitalism today and in the past tell us not only about the endurance of empire and its hierarchical subjectivity making, but also about reshaping of other than colonial temporal life worlds. When, where are the resistive remnants of such life worlds? And can we tell better, more capacious stories about it, given the devastating levels of colonial, temporal, legal, political, economic, social, epistemic, and ontological interaction? Thank you.
All right, I'll go. Thanks, Ivana, for inviting me. Thanks, Alicia and Haji for so much amazing organizational work, and thanks to everyone for being here. So to start off with, I think Ivana thinks I did no preparation for the whole thing because I was like, I need to prepare. But that was just because I had this preparation, but then I was like, wait, do I understand what methods are even? So then I had to do this preparation. So watch me, everyone here has obviously just done a perfect, like all really great presentation, trying to be randomly switching between 3 stupid documents that I've written. But we can just start with that. So if I was thinking about describing myself methodologically, as I say, I'm kind of, it's not necessarily a language that I would use. And so for me, I think of theory, method, and all of these things as collapsing together in the sense that what I am is basically a relatively old-fashioned, old-school, orthodox Marxist. Now, people might sometimes be like, well, Rob, how can that be the case? You write about all of these different things, and these aren't things that Marxists talk about. But part of the position that underscores the kind of work that I do is that if you actually look at the history of the ways in which Marxists have thought about the world, you will find that like racialized people, non-European people were often at the forefront of Marxism, literally right from the beginning, and have always been involved in this process. So the construction that some people have of orthodoxy is itself a kind of Eurocentric racist construction, which imagines that racialized people were not making big contributions to the Marxist tradition, when of course they were. And in fact, the Marxist tradition was one of the major political, intellectual, and theoretical movements organizing non-European peoples for a very long time. So that's the kind of starting point that I would take. One thing, I'm going to just now, I guess for the fun of it, but also partly because I think it also then dropped like two, bombs feels like the inappropriate word, but it's all the word that's in my head right now to think about, which is firstly, I am very skeptical about law and political economy as a tradition. And there's specific reasons for this. But one of them, very particularly, is I, as a Marxist, and again, that sounds weird, think that the construction of a thing called the economy is like a historical result of the way that capitalism makes you think about the world. And that actually a Marxist understanding does not talk about a thing called an economy. It talks about the ways in which human beings collectively, socially reproduce their material existence, which under capitalist social relations takes the form of a thing autonomous from us called the economy, which therefore kind of almost ignores the degree to which it's just a product of what we do. But actually, the economy instead encompasses the broad set of social relations through which human beings continually produce and reproduce their existence. But we'll come back to that. And secondly, I guess this is partly for fun, but I take issue with the conceptualization of racial capitalism. And racial capitalism is not my bag. I have a different conception of, I think, the relationship between capitalism and racism. So the reason that those things are important, I think, is because if we're talking about methodology, I understand a Marxist approach, which I adopt, and the approach which structures my work to be like, we need to think of societies in the context of being social totalities, which reproduce their own existence through collective human action. And given social totalities, we'll have particular modes and mechanisms through which that takes place. And it's through understanding the ways in which human societies reproduce their own existence and the kind of structures and institutions and economic patterns that this throws up, that we can begin to understand particular aspects of the social totality. So one thing that I thought was really useful about what Diamond said, and I really appreciated, was this kind of differentiation between something like phenomena, something like concept, and something like discipline. Because of course, from a Marxist perspective, all that disciplines are is temporary alignments of reified focus on one particular area, but you cannot understand law unless you understand its place in a social totality. So all that disciplinary thinking is in this context is a temporary fixed thing, which with the advent of the modern university system has become reified and then structured through particular kind of intellectual and material imperatives into this idea of disciplines. But actually, that's just a kind of temporary fix. What that also means for me is that, and again, I think just returning to what Diamond said, I think that to try and think about what's the relationship between race and the economy is in some ways a false dilemma, because it's like, no, race and the economy are both, as we would say, like forms of appearance of particular sets of social relations. And so even sometimes the term co-constitutive can't capture the way in which, look, race is one mode in which the social relations in which we live appears, and understanding the logic of that and how it relates back to these forms of collective social reproduction are really important. And the same thing for me is true of gender. So methodologically, I think our task in given moments is to understand particular phenomena, fix them in these forms of like collective social reproduction, and understand how the logic of the given social totality, mode of production or whatever, throws up particular forms, patterns, and practices, right? And that has been what has significantly informed my work. So maybe that's a little bit kind of hand-wavy abstract, I apologize, what you're gonna get. But we can then pick up to think about how we theorize and think about some of the specific phenomena that we want to talk about in this. So firstly, when we think about race and racism, I really liked, again, Diamond's typology of the kind of 4 different modes of thinking about race. But a wrinkle I want to add to this, and I think this is a wrinkle that Diamond knows, but I think it's worth bringing up, is that many conceptions of racism presuppose a pre-existing thing called race, however it's constructed, and say racism is when you discriminate based on this. But of course, from the perspective we're talking about, the prior question is, well, how does this thing called race get produced in the first place? Why is it produced, and for what purpose? Very frequently, institutional racism is not in taking the pre-existing category of race and being mean about it. It's about producing, racializing particular groups of people and managing them through that way. So when we think about race and racism, we need to think about the ways in which race as a phenomenon is produced. Otherwise, we fall into the problem of naturalizing race, thinking of race as a kind of real, empirically existing thing, and not understanding its social production, right? So one of the reasons why I think the Fanon reading there, but I would think more broadly, is Fanon is really good on thinking like, look, even things that appear natural, like blackness as a social category, in historical senses, or relatively recently, reproduced and reinvented, and Black people didn't start thinking of themselves as Black people until relatively recently in historical terms. People on the continent of Africa were not like, oh, we're all Black. They had different sets of identities and forms of organizing themselves, and Blackness came with a specific kind of intervention in that way. I've already been speaking for 7.5 minutes. That's a problem. But then very briefly, and I guess we'll come on to this in various ways. In terms of thinking, I don't want. So I'll just, what I'll do is, from these perspectives, just say two relatively brief things which can hopefully open us up to have some further discussions. So thinking about race and racism, I think there's a specific historical and material connection between racism and capitalism and value, which we'll talk about later. And that is essentially for let's say 2 reasons, which I'll then pick up in the next panel I make. The first is that the expansion of capitalism on a domestic and global scale has always relied on concentrating wealth in some places and kind of making other places poorer. It's involved significant social transformations in particular places, and these have particular geographical histories. And that has meant that capitalism has always needed ways to organize and justify, but also institutionalize the management of geographically differentiated forms of exploitation. And that's proved both internationally, but even domestically, right? So it's had the need and has produced something like what could have been race. At the same time, capitalism is a mode of production which relies continually on abstraction. And that's because when capitalism happens, like its core logic is to say, here's this coat, here's this phone. These 2 things have to have some way of being related to each other if you're going to be able to engage in exchanges. So it abstracts them out. Capitalism is a machine materially for producing abstractions. When you combine these 2 things together, racialization is essentially a mode of abstraction which takes particular characteristics of people in geopolitically and geographically differentiated forms of exploitation and situates them in the context of a hierarchy. So it's what happens when these particular institutionalized forms of inequality meet with a kind of systematic and sustained abstraction and produces practices of racialization. And I could say more about that, but, you know, again, even if I've got a little bit more time, I'm not going to take the mic. So the second point then is that I think that's also incumbent upon us to think about the functionality of what happens with gender. Because of course, another thing that people can do is pre-take gender as a pre-given kind of social phenomenon, which capitalism then, or whatever social relations we're in, like attaches itself onto. But actually, to observe the history of gendered relations is to observe the history of the way, again, in which human beings reproduce their own material existence. Gender is, of course, often linked to specific forms of labor and particular forms of collective social reproduction and otherwise. And the way in which particular modes of production have organized that have ended up producing distinct configurations of the way in which gender works. So to understand the changing and shifting histories of both gender and racialization, I think it's incumbent upon us to understand the changing social relations through which human beings collectively reproduce their own existence. But importantly, and I think this is where I'll close it, I'll try to open it up, another element that the Marxist kind of conception brings to this is to not imagine that this is entirely driven by conscious human action. One problem I have, for instance, with LPE, and people will know this, is this conception, it can be very voluntarist. It can be like, if a group of Harvard lawyers change the law, the economy is now changed. And you're like, okay. You're not even asking the question of like, why this group of Harvard lawyers are the ones that can do it? Could a group of Kenyan lawyers do it? I bet they couldn't. Like, how much can that even work? Does that stick? So when we're thinking about this, we also have to ask the questions about what Marx called laws of motion. And the fact that the way that this works is that collective human action can become reified and exerts law-like pressure on us in spite of the fact, even if we know that it's a human creation. So to understand these phenomena is also to think about these forms of collective social reproduction as things that are beyond our immediate control and therefore producing these particular kind of configurations and regimes. So I think that was a very broad thing, but that is how I would understand the kind of methodology which occupies my work and how we think about gender and race.
Thank you so much. If it's okay, I would like to start out with some observations and questions. I won't talk too long. I would also ask the audience who have joined online. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And I think, Ivana, we can actually pick up some of them later, right? When we open the floor for questions. So I would so thank you so much for all of your observations. And I think it's a wonderful way to get started on the discussion today. I was wondering about all of your understanding of the, I won't say economy now that I think rightly so qualified it as a system of social relations and the reproduction, social totality. But what is your understanding of, so in law and political economy scholarship, all of the time there was this aha eureka moment, oh, law constitutes the economy. So what is your understanding of the relationship of that kind of understanding of co-constitution? So for example, in science and technology studies, people talk about law and technology being co-constituted all the time, but what I find really frustrating about that vocabulary of co-constitution is it doesn't actually show us the actual dynamics. So for example, causality, intensity, velocity, so all the attributes that we might want to actually find more about. So what is the relationship to co-constitution to, let's say, changes in social relations? Or social reproduction? I guess these terms come from very specific traditions, scholarly traditions, but I think also they show the differences in ideology, right? So so that would be my first question. Maybe I'll stop there because I think the audience will have many more comments and questions as well.